All right, welcome to episode number 14 of the Ready Nimzo Larson Speedrun series. We are playing 3 different games against players in the rating range of 1900 up to 2000. And our first opponent, right there below the rating of 2000, rated 1999. This is Patser Pedestrian from Malaysia, it looks like. So knight of 3, d5. We're going for b3, and we'll see what kind of setup our opponent goes for. So they go for knight f6. Let's go bishop to b2. They go for pawn to c5. We've seen this exact same setup before. It is very important in these types of positions that we want to play the move pawn to e3, and we're usually aiming to put the bishop on the b5 square. Once black is committed to the move pawn to c5, we decide to go for e3 and bishop to b5 in many situations. If black had played a move like g6 or c6, in those cases we would go g3 and bishop to g2. But if they commit to c5 early in the game, we're going for the move e3. And in this case, we are going to go ahead and pin the knight. Potentially look to eliminate the knight, or go after the knight that is going to be pinned in this position. They do counter this by pinning our own knight with bishop to g4. Let's go for the move h3, just to poke the bishop and see what it does. He ends up capturing the knight. And the question is, do we want to recapture on f3 right away, or do we want to throw in the move bishop takes c6 first? I generally like the idea of messing up our opponent's pawn structure with bishop takes c6. I do think at the same time that taking on f3 without taking on c6 is perfectly fine. But I'm going to go ahead and worsen black's pawn structure first. We make this in between move or intermezzo. We throw in a check before recapturing on f3. And now we have a very nice bishop on b2. Black does have a space advantage, but their pawn structure is a little bit worse off because of the doubled c pawns and isolated a pawn. And usually what we're going to try to do here is go for moves like d3, knight to d2, maybe e4, maybe c4. We're going to try to ultimately play around the weakness on c5. We might even go knight c3 and then knight to a4 to attack the pawn. But probably some combination of d3, developing the knight, and then pushing either e4 or c4 to kind of gain a little bit more space in the center. Black goes pawn to e5, so they do gain space in the center more than they already had, but as far as I can tell, I think we can just grab the pawn on e5. I know I've made this joke if you've watched the speedrun series multiple times, but it continues to surprise me. Players just give up the e5 pawn when you play the Ready Nimzo Larson. I mean, we've seen so many games in the speedrun series where opponents, starting all the way down at like the 600 range that we began the speedrun at, players playing e5 and just letting us take the pawn in the center. E5, we play knight takes e5, and then bishop takes e5, and we win a pawn. Or in this case, we take with the bishop right away, and again, we're just winning a pawn. This player's almost 2000 rated, and just giving up a free pawn. I'm pretty sure it's unintentional, but they're just giving us a free pawn in the center of the board. So we are not going to complain. We are going to castle the king. And then I'm still going to look to play the move d3 and develop the knight afterwards. I think we'll go d3. If our bishop is hit, we'll just retreat it. I'm not really in a rush to trade bishop for knight on f6 and give their bishop a very good diagonal, so we will continue the typical plan of playing kind of around the weak pawns. I don't think that really needs to change. I think we can just go for knight to d2. I don't want to go knight c3 and block the bishop from retreating. And I think we can just develop the knight, move the rook over, probably play e4 at some point, drop the bishop back if we need to. I think e4 is going to be the pawn break that we work towards in the center as far as I can tell. It'd be really nice if you would play d4, because then we would gain a very, very strong square on c4 for the knight to sit on. So that's part of why we're going for e4 rather than c4. So he goes queen a5. He is threatening the knight that's on the d2 square. Let's make sure that knight's protected. Rook to d1 looks safe enough. Could also bring the queen back, but I kind of like the active queen where it is. Let's just go rook to d1 to protect. And we're just up a pawn, better pawn structure. We are behind on space, that's true, but otherwise everything else is pretty good about our position, and we have no real weaknesses. We could bring the bishop back to b2 to cover some of the weak, maybe some of the slightly weak dark squares. but we're also not really in a rush to move the bishop. If black ever wants to make an attack on our bishop, they're going to have to move their bishop out of the way. But if they move the bishop, they need to keep the protection over their knight. If they play bishop f8, then I'm going to take the knight that's on f6. If they go bishop d8, here I'm not going to take the knight because it's defended a bit better. But they are attacking the bishop, so we do need to do something about that here. I think I'm just going to go back to b2. I don't think that is a problem for us. Bishop on d8 looks very passive. The queen's not really doing a ton over on the queen side on its own, and e4 is still the game plan that we're going to go for pretty soon. I may also throw in the move a3 or a4 just to make sure that the a pawn's not a liability. So, yeah, extra pawn, better pawn structure, no weaknesses. I think we are in pretty good shape. Rook to e6. Okay, I think that they want to move this bishop without worrying about us taking the knight is my guess. But this doesn't really alter my plan of playing pawn to e4. So I think I'm going to just go ahead and stick with that idea. If the d pawn disappears, whether it moves forward or takes us, it does open up the square on c4. Right now, we very well may take the pawn on d5, and then maybe we'll take the knight, followed by taking the d5 pawn. It is a case here where the pawn on d5 is under enough pressure that black has to be concerned about us maybe taking the pawn, and then some problems revolving around the weakness of the pawn there. I might also take the pawn and then use this pin along the diagonal. Maybe I can trade the pawns and then still hop the knight into the c4 square. That also looks pretty good, because if they were to take my knight after these pawns are traded, then I would take the rook on a8. So that's another idea to consider here. This knight can't move without losing the pawn. If this pawn moves, they give up the c4 square. If this, the rook and bishop are not really doing a ton. They play bishop to c7. I think I can take the pawn. They take back. And then I'm not entirely sure if I want to take the knight. I mean, I could take the knight and then take the pawn, and then I think we're just up 2 pawns in that position. That looks pretty good as far as I can tell. Is there anything I am missing? I don't think so. I think that looks pretty good. I don't want to take the knight first because rook takes would hit the queen, and I don't have the chance to take the pawn yet. So I think I'm going to take here. Taking with the knight would technically save the pawn, but it would give me a great square on c4, and black's pawn structure would be atrocious afterwards. Everything would be isolated on the queen side. So they do take back with the pawn. I think I can take the knight. I can also go knight c4, taking advantage of the pin, and then once the queen moves away somewhere, then I can play knight to e3. That also looks pretty good, but I also don't entirely see a problem with taking the knight and then taking the pawn. That also looks pretty good, once again. So I think we're going to go for that. Let's grab the knight and then take the pawn. They're going to play rook to d8 for sure, counterattacking the queen. And then the question is, where do I want to move the queen to? I'm leaning towards something like b7 just to be annoying and put some pressure on the bishop. I don't really want to go to c4 and block the knight, and I also don't really want to go to e4 and block the knight. So h5 is even available, I will say. Kind of keeping a little bit of a pin along the diagonal, or along the file there. Where do I want to put the queen? Not here, not here. b7. I don't really want to go to g5 and get hit by the bishop, so it's b7 or h5. Those are kind of my 2 main options I'm considering. How do I want to do this? I'm not entirely sure. Queen here. I guess queen here looks pretty safe. He can't really attack me. I mean, he could play rook to b8, I guess, and then maybe then I do have to go back to e4, but Okay, I think I'm going to jump in here and just be a tad bit annoying, and the game plan is to play knight c4 or knight e4 next move. I am a little bit cautious here because there are some weak squares. If you can get the queen to c3 and try to hit the c2 pawn, it can be a little bit annoying. But if he goes queen to c3, first things first, I can take the bishop. But even if I couldn't take the bishop, I could play knight to e4, attacking the queen as well as the rook on f6. Now here, bishop to e5 looks reasonable because he is attacking the rook, and if the rook moves away, then I lose the pawn. However, knight to c4 looks to be pretty good. I think I can go here, and I think I'm going to just hit the queen and hit the bishop. He goes to c3. However, now I think instead of taking the bishop right away, I think I can play queen to e7, which hits the bishop as well as the rook. And that looks to be, as far as I can tell, that's kind of a lights out situation. I don't think there's a good way to protect both of these simultaneously. And I think we can just take we're going to take one of these two pieces next move. There's just no way to guard both. He can go rook d5. Technically, that guards both, but then he gets back rank checkmated. So that doesn't work out too well. So yeah, we're up 2 pawns. We're about to be ahead more, or we'll get back rank checkmate if black defends incorrectly. So taking the rook, of course, is the main threat, but taking the bishop is the secondary alternative threat. I don't think there's a whole lot black can do to defend. I mean, he can try queen to d4, guarding the rook and counterattacking the pawn, but then I can still take the bishop. He gets the pawn, the king moves over. There's not really much of a follow-up at that point, and then I'm just up a piece. And I can defend the king side pretty easily after that, I think. Might be black's best move to try that, but we're still in pretty good shape, of course, being ahead material. So what will they come up with here? Not so sure. Not so sure. Okay, I guess this does technically guard the rook and the bishop. This does move the bishop and guard the rook, but the bishop is free to be captured as far as I can tell. So we just take that. We still threaten the rook. And again, we're still up a piece. He doesn't have time to take the pawn because we would take the rook. He goes here to attack the pawn. I don't want to do something like rook to d2 and lose my rook. That'd be very bad. I'm going to just move the knight backwards. And I think that should be fine. I think we can just move the knight here to keep the king safe, block off the attack. He's probably going to go rook e8 and try some kind of capture, but I don't think it's going to be enough. I think we can just go for the move rook to e1. You could also just bring the queen back to g3, but rook e1 looks fine. Just line up. If he takes the knight, I don't even need to take back. I can just check on the back rank at that point. I could take the pawn if I want to, but now the main goal is to just activate my remaining pieces, and the extra material will be, more than good enough. I'm going to move the rook into the game. Let's play something like rook to d1. I want to make sure that the rook's not hanging on the a1 square in any situations. Then we can put the pawn on a4 if this is ever attacked. As far as I can tell, this can just be captured for free. He can maybe move the queen over to hit the pawn, but I can bring the queen back to defend. Not a big deal. I can also play knight g4 to attack the rook. That also looks pretty simple. Yeah, let's do that. We hit the rook, we guard the pawn, but we also offer the trade of rooks on the e-file at the same time. So we're going to trade the pair of rooks. If he takes us, we'll take back. Yeah, let's take back here. We're also still attacking the rook on f6 and guarding the pawn on f2, and the pawn on c5 is hit. The back rank check is in the air. This check is in the air. Okay, he's going to try some kind of h5, queen takes h3, some attack on the g file. I don't think this should really work. I'm going to check like this. He'll move. Here I'll go for the move queen to d8. I'm attacking the queen as well as threatening checkmate, so he pretty much has to trade the queens. He can take on g4, but then we'll just take the rook there. I guess he could play rook g5, and then after the check, the king moves up the board, but I mean, that looks very sketchy. We should have some strong attack or checkmate around the corner from there somehow. So, okay, he does take on g4. I guess for good measure, we can just give the check first. Do we need to? I don't think so. Let's just take here. He's going to take back. Let's just make sure there's no crazy perpetual check idea. Excuse me. Excuse me. Okay. Let's do. Just gonna play queen to e7. I guess you could check king here. Check. Block. Feels like the rook isn't doing anything. Let's go here. If he checks on the back rank, I'll just block with the queen. If he takes the pawn, it's really not a problem. Okay, let's just check here with the queen. It's going to block. And we'll move the queen to this square. If he checks, we move to h2. We've got the h5 square covered. This is not a perpetual check problem. We are threatening checkmate of our own on h8. The only way to stop that is to play like some kind of g5, which is probably not a bad attempt. But then we should have checkmate somewhere around the corner, some kind of rook h8, rook g8. Something should be in there. Yeah, he tries g5. He does actually have, you know, a check. It's not perpetual check because I can still block with the queen, but it's at least an attempt, a reasonable attempt, I would say. Here, I'm gonna do this first. Let's just offer a trade of queens. Probably a billion ways to win here. I'm just gonna offer the trade of queens, snuff out the whole entire queen h5 idea. He'll probably go queen to c1 is my guess. I'll check on e4. Yeah, so I'll check on e4. Cover this square. Let's check here. As long as we keep the f4 square covered, we should be in good shape. He blocks. Doesn't block. Okay, we can check with the rook on this square. King goes to h5, I assume. And then pawn to f3 followed by pawn to g4 looks pretty close to checkmate. There's no stalemates. He has plenty of pawns that can move, so I think I can just play f3. Queen f5 also looks like it's game over pretty much. Maybe that's a little simpler. Here we threaten queen to h3 checkmate. And yeah, I mean, as long as we don't flag here, we win the game for sure. He'll probably try queen f4 check, trying to trade queens and hope he can flag me, but I have plenty of time to pick up a bunch of pawns, push back. I can also just push my a pawn down the board to promote. So yeah, this is the checkmate threat. Can't really stop that without trading the queens, as far as I can tell. He's also getting low on time himself. Okay, so he does trade the queens. Let's go just push the a pawn. Okay, many ways to win. He's never going to get stalemated. If he plays h5, I have g3 check. And okay, he's trying to stalemate himself somehow, but this just goes and gets himself checkmated. His king has nowhere to move. He takes the pawn, I take back, and we do get the checkmate. So we got the win here against a high-rated opponent, right there, a tinge bit below 2,000. Let's go ahead and do the game review and check that out. All right, looks like we played at a 92.6% accuracy to our opponent's 80.2. We had one miss and one inaccuracy, so we'll find those later on. So in the analysis here, our opponent, we start off with knight f3, and we've seen all of these moves here. They go for d5, knight f6, c5. We go for e3 in these situations. We pin the knight, attack the bishop. We take on c6 first before recapturing on f3. If we do recapture on f3 right away, black might play something like queen to b6, I suppose. Hit the bishop, guard the knight. It's still a better position for white. We can go pawn to c4, and white is still better here for sure. But I just decided to take the knight on c6 and mess up the pawn structure first. e5 is simply put a huge blunder. We can simply take the pawn for free. And then after developing, we get the knight in the game, we protect the knight, we retreat the bishop. We're really just reacting to black's threats with the knowledge that the longer the game goes on, even if we have to make a few defensive moves, then we are still going to be up the pawn with a better pawn structure and a much better position. So I went for e4. I ended up taking on d5, take on f6, take on d5 again, and now we're just up 2 pawns. I moved the queen to the b7 square, which I'm happy to see is the best move by a bit of a margin. I was also thinking about queen h5, but I felt like the queen might get targeted or kicked around a little bit more, like rook to h6 or pawn to g6 is a little bit annoying. I went here instead, though, move the bishop. Knight c4 is a good reaction. Rather than defending against our opponent's threats, we make a bigger threat than what they're threatening. They hit a rook, we hit a queen. They move away. Queen e7 is a tactical operation to attack the 2 pieces. We win the bishop, block with the knight, and for the most part, we are just grabbing stuff when it's given to us, defending against our opponent's threats, trading stuff, offering the trade of queens. Now we're up a full rook. And even though we're a full rook ahead, we still have to be a little bit careful about some perpetual check ideas. For instance, if we just played, I don't know, let's say we played just some kind of completely random move, maybe some queen b6 or something. Black can check, check. If you go back to g1, they just keep checking. You have to move up the board. It looks like we would still be able to run away at this point. You know, black is eventually going to run out of checks at some point here. I guess f1 and rook blocks, and we do eventually stop all of the checks, but it feels very unnecessary. I just decided to bring the queen back, get ready to block the checks on the first rank if they occur. And then, you know, I was just very, I would say I was just very conscious of stopping the opponent's counterplay. There definitely is faster ways of playing. I could have played rook h8 check, and I could have done stuff to win the game a bit quicker, apparently. But I just decided to stop all the counterplay. Checked on e4, checked on e5, checked on g8. I apparently missed mate in 2, which is pretty silly. Yeah, queen to e2 check would have just won the game, and then g3. But, okay, queen f5. It's labeled as a miss, but we're still pretty much guaranteed to win the game. I probably could have checkmated quicker from here as well. I just decided to push the a-pawn up the board, eventually got the checkmate, and got the win. So, anyways, though, nice game against a pretty high-rated opponent. That's it for our first one. Let's go ahead and get into our second game. All right, we got our second game here. Playing against Godzi Ibn TTV. I don't know if that's maybe streaming. Usually TTV is like Twitch TV. But okay, anyways, rated 1926 from the United States. So knight f3, c5. We are going to stick with our b3 approach. c5 is a solid move that gives some control over the center, so no need for us to do anything super changing. You know, we don't have to play e4 right away. If you wanted to play e4 after c5, you could, but then you would just be playing a Sicilian against a Sicilian defense at that point. So I'm going to go for bishop to b2. We could play e4 if black allows us. He doesn't, though. He plays knight f6. In this particular setup, we are going to go for pawn to g3, followed by bishop to g2. If the knight was on c6 already, then we might consider e3 followed by e3 followed by bishop to b5. Or if the pawn was already on d5, then we would go e3 and bishop b5 check. But if we go e3 here, we're not going to go to b5 if there's no pawn move and no knight move, because then we would just get hit by the a-pawn. And so if we play e3, we would really have to go bishop e2 afterwards, and that is just much more passive than the bishop being on the g2 square. So we're going g3. If he had done knight c6 before we played g3, then we would play e3, but because we've already committed to g3, we are going to stick with bishop to g2. And a5, it's an interesting option. Feels like black's a little bit all over the place. Like, these moves are all fine. a5 is also not a bad move, generally speaking. Black wants to play a4 and create some pressure over on the queen side, but I don't think it's really that big of a deal if the pawn gets there. We can, maybe take it or something like that if we really needed to. I can also just play a4 myself, which gives me good control over the b5 square. I haven't committed the c pawn yet. If my pawn was already on c4, I might not want to play a4 because then the b4 square would be weak. But I do think a4 right now is actually not a bad idea. I think I'm just going to do that. I don't know if this is the best move or not, but let's just kind of stop black's idea, and we get more control over the b5 square ourselves. We can play knight a3 or knight c3 and put the knight on b5 one day. Let's go for castles, and I think I'll go for an e3 d4 setup. I don't really want to push the c pawn as much anymore because I'll give up the square on b4, but I think I'll go for an e3 d4 approach. So let's go do it that way. So d4. Pawn is taken. Do I want to take with the knight or do I want to take with the pawn? I could kind of see an argument for both of them, quite honestly. Knight takes, opens up the bishop. I think I'm going to take with the pawn, though. Yeah, I think I'm going to use the pawn. Let's use that. My bishop does get kind of shut down a bit on the b2 square, but the bishop on d7 is also shut in at the same time. And I think we can go for knight to e5 ourselves, which looks pretty good. The question is, do I want to go knight e5 immediately? I probably do. I don't really see a reason not to. We might as well hop in. Probably swing the other knight over to support the knight, maybe f4 to support. I guess we can just go knight to d2 and continue building the, improving the knight and supporting the center. I'm not really in a rush to take the bishop on d7 since that bishop is very bad and blocked in at this point anyways. I'd really rather black take me and then my pawn kind of pester the knight in this situation. So let's stick with knight to d2. And if black plays some kind of knight to b4 move, we can play c3 there to kick the knight and make sure the c2 pawn is safe. So what does black do? Could also consider playing f4, but then there's sometimes queen b6 ideas, which are a little bit annoying. Also, f4 kind of weakens the e4 square. Black is not really threatening anything as far as I can tell. If he takes this, I take back. I attack the knight that's on the f6 square. I think I can just play rook e1, probably. Yeah, so I'll just reinforce the knight. And then maybe I'll play c3, and then maybe even one day bishop to a3 to trade off my bad bishop could be useful. Bishop d6 isn't really threatening anything either. I mean, if he takes this, the bishop is helping to support from the b2 square. I don't really want to use the other knight yet, because then black brings their knight to e4. How do we want to do this? I could start something kind of weird like g4, g5. I mean, black is really holding off on castling, which is a little bit odd in my opinion. Maybe even rook e3 and queen e2, something like that. I don't really mind that idea. Let's actually do that. I'm going to go rook e3. Then queen e2. I didn't want to go queen e2 right away because I thought knight to b4 going after the c2 pawn would be annoying, and if I push the pawn, the knight jumps in and makes the fork. So I kind of want to keep the queen on d1 to make sure that the pawn on c2, or not even the pawn so much, so that the square on c2 is a bit more reinforced. But now I am really liking the look of g4, g5. Maybe the rook could even swing over to h3, which could be very strong. like g4, h6, h4, g5, rook h3. Like that looks actually very, very dangerous. So I think I'm going to go kind of a very aggressive mode here, you could call it. But the aggression here is mainly based on the fact that we have more control over the center of the board. We control the e5 square, our bishop and pawn and rook are all good. Here we're going to take back and now attack the knight. The knight has to go back to e8. I guess I guess black could try d4. d4 could be a little bit tricky. Let's see if he does that. If he does d4, no, he moves the knight back. So, yeah, d4 could have been interesting there, I will say. Now, I really want to make sure that this pawn stays secure. If he gets to play d4 and then take the pawn, that would be a little bit unfortunate. So what do we do? I could go g5, queen h5, rook h3. So let's say g5, d4, rook h3, queen takes, queen h5. That looks pretty dangerous for black, I will say. That looks pretty scary. Yeah, I think I'm going to do that, actually. Let's go for that. So g5, I want to play queen h5 and rook h3, and I just want to go checkmate. That's as simple as it is here, quite honestly. And even if he gets the e5 pawn, so, okay, he is playing d4. Let's go rook h3. I also have ideas like knight e4 to f6 check, which could be very dangerous. Now, he does have queen takes e5, queen h5, h6. And then if I take, he will trade the queens. But even in that position, I have the pair of bishops. The knight on e8 is very bad. His king is still a bit weak. I think we're still in very, very good shape at that point. And if he plays g6 to stop me from playing queen h5, I might just play f4 and then, you know, then keep everything very well secure there. And then as soon as he plays g6, he weakens the square on f6, and I can go knight e4 and knight f6 check, which is a huge problem for him. So he either needs to take on e5 with the queen, because then if queen h5, he has this h6 idea, or he needs to play g6 or stop the queen from getting to h5 in the first place. Because even if he takes the e5 pawn, he still can't play knight f6 afterwards because the g pawn covers the f6 square. So he does take with the queen. Now the question is, do I want to go queen h5, or is there anything else I could do? He is also hitting g5, so queen h5, h6. I can take, but I can also go to something like knight f3 first, maybe? I think transitioning into this in-game is pretty good, though, I will say. He's probably going to play h6. I guess he could play queen f5, but then bishop e4, I think, just wins the game there, as far as I can tell. So he has to play h6. I think that's pretty much mandatory. f6 also opens up an escape square for the king, but I think I take on h7, and it just feels very, very scary for black in that position. I'm not sure if I have a win, but it looks very, very scary. So what will he do? I think h6 is mandatory, but we'll see if he does it. Okay, he plays h6. How do we want to do this? He has threatening queen takes g5, right? So if I go knight c4 or something, he'll play queen takes g5, and then he has up 2 pawns. I have a feeling there could be something better than what I'm about to play, but I think I'm going to take on h6 and offer the trade of queens. I'm going to take back on h5. And now, if he takes on h6, I think I'll take back with the rook. And we're going to have equal material, but I have the pair of bishops. It's a pretty open position. The king is kind of weak. The knight's stuck protecting the d4 pawn. My knight can jump forward to some good squares. Maybe I can even move the king and swing the rook over to the g file to help attack. Bishop a3 also is an idea that that black has to be careful about. Like even right here, I might actually have like bishop takes knight and bishop a3 to trap the rook if he's not careful. If he takes on h6, if he plays knight f6, I might have rook g5 to pin the pawn. Yeah, so maybe rook g5 to pin the pawn as far as I can tell. I can also take g7 first, which might even be a little bit cleaner. Rook g5, he has g6, and it's a little bit hard to find the correct move there. I think I'll take this and attack the rook. If he takes with the king, okay, we're going to take the rook here. He'll take back with the rook or the king. I'm not sure which one. And then I think he's going to have a little bit of trouble keeping this pawn defended. That's kind of my idea here. Like knight c4, eliminate the knight, take the d4 pawn, take the a5 pawn. Like that's kind of the gist of things I'm looking at. So I don't want to take the knight right away. I guess it is possible to make that exchange, but I think I'll do knight to... let's do knight c4 first. I might not want to actually take the knight on c6. I might want to move the bishop, move the king, and swing the rook over for a check. And there could be some king safety issues that white has to be careful about. If I take on c6 and then d4, this knight's going to become a big problem because I'll have no light square protection around my king. And even though I would be up a pawn in that position, it feels a little shaky to give up the bishop for the knight just to win a pawn. Especially if it does turn into an opposite color bishop situation. Have to be a little bit careful about some drawish tendencies. So he does play knight to f4. I will play bishop f3, I think. The plan is to move the king and give a check. He wants to do the same thing, so he has the same idea. Not gonna lie, a little bit annoying. I think instead of king h1, I think I'll go h4 and king h2. I can also go bishop c1 to attack the knight, and then maybe bishop to d2 to hit the a pawn. I think I'm going to do that, actually. Let's hit the knight. I don't really want to take on c6 and then d4 at any point, so I need to use the bishop on b2 to do something different, is kind of what I'm feeling. If he does give a check, I'll move to f1 this time. Knight here, I think I have bishop to g2. I can also throw in a check at any point if I want to encourage black to play f5. I don't know if I want him to play that move, but it is at least an option. Knight back to d5. Let's go bishop to d2 and pester the a pawn. And then I can bring the rook over to e1 in the near future. It is equal material, but I feel like black has more kind of targets in their position. I have the pair of bishops. My pieces are all pretty active. The bishop on d7 is pretty bad. This rook will get active pretty soon. And so I think with all those things kind of combined together, I think we're doing totally fine. Okay, knight takes here is not really a problem because we have bishop to e4 check. So I think I can do this. I can take this. If he takes back, I take on b4, and if he takes on c2, I check on e4 and take the knight on c2. I think he's missed this check. I do have the bishop on d2, keeping the knight on a5 protected. And I'm going to take the knight on c2 regardless of what he does next move. So, bit unfortunate for him, as far as I can tell, kind of walking into this tactical problem. And so, yeah, the tactic kind of secures us the win of material. Even if he hadn't played knight takes c2, we would have still been up a pawn with a pretty good position as far as I can tell, but now we're just up a piece with a winning position rather than just a good position. Keeps the knight on the board. Reasonable to do that. He wants to play knight f3. I'm just going to play king to e2, I believe. Keep the knight off the f3 square. And I guess he could play rook to g2. Probably I'll play h3 to keep the knight off of g4. If he checks on d3, I'll take that. I really just want to play like bishop f4 or even knight back to c4. I just want to trade pieces at this point. If I can get rid of this knight, then black loses like all semblance of an attack. b5 is not a bad move, to be honest with you. I don't want to take it and have the bishop move forward. Would be kind of annoying. Let's go bishop d3. I don't care if he makes the trade. That's totally fine. If he takes on a4, I'll take back. No big deal. I still want to play knight to c4 if this b-pawn disappears and try to trade pieces. That's still my idea. I don't really care if he trades off the knight for the bishop. That's totally fine with me. I do also have now a pass pawn on the a-file, so that's also pretty good. There might be more precise ways to do things from here, but it is what it is. This is, this is what we'll work with. Yeah, so knight c4. I will say that move's a little bit annoying, because knight c4, he takes the bishop and makes a pin, which is kind of concerning, I will say. I think we can still do it. Because we can always play rook c1 to protect the knight. I don't think that's that big of a deal. Okay, retreats, reasonable. I think I will now just go knight d6. I will take this bishop next move. If it goes to a6, we can take that. So we'll make this capture here. Then I will just pin the knight. And then next we'll play like bishop to b4. And as far as I can tell, not much that he can do to avoid running into trouble with the pin at this point. So making the pin kind of shuts all of black's pieces down. He moves the rook off of the pin. Here he takes the bishop. We get the rook. We can now simply push the pawn, push the pawn, push the pawn, make the queen, and now we're just up tons of material. Let's play rook a5 to cut the king off, push the h-pawn, push the pawn, move the bishop. Just push the pawn again. Check. 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 And checkmate. Okay, so we got the win on this one. A little bit of a long-winded game, 55 moves, but yeah, let's go ahead and bring this over to the game review board and we'll check it out there. Alright, so we got our game review here. Looks like we played at a 91.6% accuracy compared to our opponent's 83.5%. On the graph, it looks like we were pretty much better the entire game, but there was a spot where we had an advantage and then it dipped a bit closer to equality, so we'll figure out what we could have done a bit better on this one. Did have 2 mistakes, and our opponent had 1 blunder, so let's check it out. So we go for knight f3, c5, b3, e6, bishop e2, knight f6, and the computer says that e3 is playable here as well. I decided to go for g3. My rule of thumb that I tend to think or kind of lean towards is if the knight is on c6 or the pawn is on d5, then I am a little bit more leaning towards the idea of e3. Whereas if the knight and the pawn are not on those 2 squares, or not on one of those 2 squares, then I lean towards g3. That's kind of the heuristic I think of. So he put the knight on c6 now. We went bishop g2. a5 felt a little weird during the game, but not some kind of gigantic mistake. I just decided to play a4 to stop that pawn from pushing. Castled, went for e3, went for d4, and we already have a pretty decent advantage here. The main problem for black is they are just kind of having passive bishops especially. They tried trading pawns and playing d5, which does equalize the space for black across the center. The biggest issue, though, is the bishop on d7 ends up being a pretty bad piece, and it's a lot easier for us to use the e5 square compared to our opponent using the e4 square. I decided to hop right into e5 immediately. And for instance, if black tries to do the same thing themselves, if they try to play knight to e4, I think I was leaning towards taking the knight and then queen to g4. It's not necessarily the best way to play the position. Apparently black is actually a little bit better, even though they're down a pawn. I guess the benefit for them is their light square bishop does become very strong. But that was at least something I was considering if black had jumped into e4 right away. Even if black does this, we don't necessarily have to take it. We could play knight to d2 or something. And white is a little bit better off in this position anyways. Black decided to play rook to c8. I went for knight to d2, queen c7, support the knight, bishop d6. Rook e3, it says, was a little bit of an inaccuracy. I wasn't actually entirely sure what to play here. If the computer's top move is to play knight to b1 and then go to a3 and then b5, I guess that makes sense, but not my first instinct in the position. So that's a pretty good maneuver to be aware of. The knight is not really doing a ton from the d2 square, so getting it around to b5 does make a lot of sense. I guess if that's the case, maybe I should have just gone to a3 right away. And it does, the computer does say knight a3, you know, going into b5 is also a good idea. So, okay, I got my knight into a little bit of an awkward location. Rook e3 I went for, then I went for g4, and apparently I made a little bit of a miscalculation. It looks like black can trade the knights and then take the c2 pawn because my bishop is hanging. And here I would have actually been in some trouble. I would have to find the move knight to c4, which is not the most obvious move in the world here. Yeah, this would have actually been a bit difficult, I will say. My idea with g4 was to do exactly, you know, what happened in the game, and I don't think knight takes e5 followed by queen takes c2 is the easiest tactic in the world to find. But I kind of wonder, like, could black have done that a move ago? Could he have done that right here? I guess he technically could have, but if we move the bishop, I think he's just going to lose one of the two pieces as far as I'm aware. So then my question would kind of be, what if we just move the bishop here? Why does that not work? Bishop to b4, take, rook e2. I guess rook e2 he trades queens. But rook h3 says black is better, but I don't know. This would look kind of scary, I guess. And if black does trade the queens, the bishop is hit, the pawn on g7 is hit. Apparently black is still doing fine here, but looks a little bit tricky for black, I will say. So anyways, in the game, black ended up making a mistake by playing bishop takes e5, knight retreated. I did say during the game that maybe d4 was an option here, but I actually was leaning towards taking the knight and then taking back, because now the bishop is very open. Knight e4 is a big idea. You can still attack on the king side pretty well. This would have actually been a pretty interesting position, because even though I'm down the exchange, my pieces are very active and the king on g8 is not the safest. So that would have been an interesting idea. Instead, he retreated the knight. I played g5. He did hit the rook, picked up the pawn. Queen h5 was the best move. And then here apparently knight f3 is better than what I played. Pawn takes on h6 is the second best move, I will say, but knight f3 was a little bit better. And then if the queen went to f5, then bishop to a3, knight to b4 blocks off the diagonal, but now you can take on d4, and I guess that this position is better than what we had in the game. Even though that wouldn't necessarily be... Oh, I guess you have c3 to attack the pin piece. Yeah, maybe something like this was actually a bit better than the way the game went, but pawn takes h6 was the second best move. It says it's a mistake because I suppose the difference between the best move and the second best move is large enough that the computer says that it's a mistake. But, I mean, we still end up with a preferable position. Rook g5 apparently was better than taking on g7, but again, white is still better even after all of this. And apparently I should have taken on c6 and then taken on d4. So definitely some slight inaccuracies here, but it kind of felt like I still had a good position regardless of all of this. I went for bishop f3. Yeah, surprisingly it says that black is doing fine here. I didn't really feel that way during the game because I felt like black was the one with all of the weaknesses. And I had the pair of bishops, and the bishop on d7 wasn't that great. So maybe if black defends super accurately, they're okay at this point, but it feels difficult for a human. Maybe I'm a bit biased, but it feels a little bit difficult for black compared to white. Like I was happy being white in this position. So bishop c1 to kick the knight away, king f1, bishop d2 is the best move to target the a5 pawn. And then here he does make a tactical mistake. I was able to pick up the pawn on a5. If he does take back on a5, I take on b4. And then here we are just up a pawn, which is very good. He made the mistake of going for the c2 pawn, and I knew that this wouldn't work well because the king on h7 allows me to make this check with bishop e4, take the knight, and then for the most part, the rest of the game was just about converting the advantage. We were just exchanging pieces, making this pin, winning more material, and then ultimately the pass pawn allows us to push on this side of the board, and then the pass pawn on the other side of the board gets us the win by making a queen. All right, so that's it for our second game. Let's go ahead and get into our third one. All right, we've got our third game. We're against Chess Master PTT 87, it looks like, rated 2003 from Indonesia. And I think this is our first opponent, all of the speedruns so far, that is over the rating of 2000. So we are still at 1913, but this particular player is over the rating of 2000. After c5, we're going for b3. I think one of the earlier games in this episode had the same starting move with c5. Now, against the move d5 on move number 2, we do have to be a bit precise with our move order. If we go for bishop to b2, black has the ability to play f6 followed by e5, and that could be a little bit of a tricky spot for us. So we've had this exact same position through a little bit of a different move order in previous episodes. I do recommend the move pawn to e3 in this position. And the idea is that if black did play f6, then we would be able to play d4, and our e3 pawn defends our d4 pawn. Now instead, black plays knight to c6. Here we can either go for bishop to b5 right away, or we can play bishop to b2 first. I'm going to go for bishop to b2 first. But the idea is to play bishop to b5 next move, and pretty soon here. So we are going to play bishop to b5 to create the pin, and we're really looking to fight for control over the e5 square in the center of the board. We are going to capture the knight most likely, but we're not going to rush to capture the knight until black is kind of provoking us by attacking the bishop. So we're going to castle first. Black might play a6, which they do. We're going to take the knight now, and then we're going to jump our knight into the e5 square, potentially looking to take the bishop and double up black's pawns, which black does avoid by having the rook protect. And as a follow-up here, we are going to stick with our typical idea of d3, knight to d2, pawn to f4, and really just look to play around the dark squares that we control pretty well in the center of the board. So let's go for d3, knight d2, f4. Black goes for b5. I think he wants to drop the bishop back. Now the question here is, do we want to take the bishop given the circumstance? If he is going to try to retreat the bishop, does it make sense for us to capture the bishop and not let black, not let black maintain the bishop pair? It could be very logical to go for that here, I will say. Taking the bishop given the circumstance. Like, you could also make an argument that we should just stick to what we're doing in the first place. Knight to d2, maybe bishop retreats. You could even play knight f3 there. Black would have to worry about knight to g5 ideas attacking the pawn. I think given the circumstance, though, I think I am going to take the bishop, and then I will still continue with the move knight to d2, and I think c4 is a potential idea for us to do in a position like this. a4 or c4, kind of leaning towards c4 myself here. We could also just continue knight f3, knight e5, and kind of get the same type of position without really any big differences either. Do I want to play c4 or do I want to play knight f3? That is kind of the question. I think I'll stick with knight f3. We don't need to tussle in the center of the board just yet. I'm going to get the knight to the e5 square. Probably play f4 and maybe c4 after that, but I do want to get the knight to e5 before I kind of decide on things. So bishop goes to the d6 square. I think we can still play the move knight to e5 anyways. If the bishop takes, we're pretty happy to take back and have a bishop versus knight imbalance. And this bishop is going to be pretty nicely placed on this diagonal. I do think that black is going to want to play a move like knight to d7 to kick the bishop away. But I think in the meantime, we are going to stick with pawn to f4 and probably try to create some attacking chances over in the kingside direction. The question is, do we go f4? c4 is still a move that's kind of on the cards, you could say. That's still a possibility as well. I think I'm going to go for c4. I want to get a little bit of a foothold in the center of the board. We also kind of freeze the pawn on c5, which could be a potential target down the road at the right time. And if some pawns get traded, that's not too big of a problem for us. He does retreat the bishop as expected. I think I'll bring the bishop back to the b2 square. We could throw in a capture of one of these pawns first, but I kind of want to leave the pawn on the c4 square for the moment. So we'll do that. We might also be able to play queen to g4 to threaten checkmate and use the bishop that's well placed on this diagonal as well. So what will black do? They can't play e5 to block the diagonal because then it hangs the d5 pawn. Queen to g4 also will help to protect the c4 pawn if necessary. He plays queen g5 himself, which is an interesting attempt. I do think this kind of walks into the f4 move that we were kind of wanting to play anyways, though. We can go f4 once the queen moves, then we can either play queen to g4 or rook f3 to g3, and I think that looks pretty reasonable. So f4 is our follow-up. If queen goes to g6, then rook f3 to g3 is pretty good. Yeah, it doesn't look completely obvious for black to stop that. It's also available to play a move like pawn to f5, I will say. And then if black takes the pawn, we take the d5 pawn. That actually looks pretty decent as well. I think I'll start with rook f3 first, though. I do want to get the rook to this g3 square, which could be very good. We're also even now threatening to play bishop takes g7. Because if the king takes, you pin. If the queen takes, you pin. So bishop takes g7 is also a threat. For instance, if black plays queen to g4, rather than playing rook g3 and allowing black to trade the queens and then defend the pawn, if queen g4, we can actually play bishop takes g7 right away. So rook g3 is a pretty big threat. If the knight goes to f6, I think we still play rook g3 anyways. And if the queen comes to f5, then rook to g5 traps the queen. So f6 is possible, and it might very well be black's best move, but then maybe now we have this, we still have this f5 idea. f5, pawn takes, take on d5. Black has to probably play rook to d6, and then I guess there it's a little bit hard to guard the d5 pawn, I will say. So maybe we won't rush to do that. I still don't think we're really bothered by the pawns being traded here. So the question is, how do we get the a1 rook in the game? That's kind of what I want to figure out next here. It is possible to take on b5, play a4, and then have a pass pawn on the a file. Could be useful. Let's see. I can also go rook g3, queen retreats, and still play queen to g4 just to continue keeping the pressure up on black's position. Rook g3, queen moves, and queen f3 also is a reasonable idea to try to pin the d-pawn. Maybe I'll do that. Let's go rook g3. I think we'll make this threat. Queen f7 is the move I expect for black to play. Then queen f3 I think we will go for. And yeah, let's try this. Other moves might be good too, but here we're trying to pin the d pawn. He does get away from the pin. However, now he has some other little tricks he has to worry about. For instance, if we can get rid of the c5 pawn, then bishop to a3 would create a skewer. So we could actually take the pawn on b5, then play d4, or take the pawn, then play bishop a3, and the c5 pawn could be a little bit of a target there. Could also take d5 and then play d4. That way of doing it also seems like it would be reasonable. Take b5, then d4. Or do we take d5 and then play d4? I think I'm going to take d5 and then play d4. I think that's the way I'm going to do it. So I'm expecting the pawn to take back. If the rook takes, I'll probably still play d4 anyways. I could also play e4 after the rook takes, if that happens. Yeah, maybe I would go for e4. If I can... Okay, just stick with the pawn. So my plan was to play d4 here. And then if pawn takes, then I have bishop to a3 winning material, as far as I can tell. Yeah, I think I can try this out. If he plays c4, bishop a3 also skewers the rook. So this entire d4 idea is based on having this bishop a3 move available. So he does play c4, he gains a passed pawn, but I think he's missing that bishop to a3 is going to skewer the two rooks. I'm going to take one of the two rooks next move. He needs to deal with the rook on d6 being completely hanging. And that's the, I would say, kind of main threat that I have in this position. And so, yeah, once he moves, we do take this. If the queen takes, we take the pawn on d5, so we probably should take with the knight. And then I think I'm going to go for the move pawn to e4. And the goal is to... Let's see, I could also take on c4 first, since the d-pawn's pinned. I think I'm going to do e4, though. I want to open up this position, the more files that open up, the better for me. That's kind of the idea with this move. Because I have the two rooks and my opponent only has one rook, I want to be opening the files up. Probably going to play this. I don't want to go to d5. He would check and then take my queen on d5. So I'm going to come back to c2 just to attack the pawn on c4. And now the question is, do I take with the queen or do I take with something else? I think I'm going to take with the queen. I could take with the pawn. I think I'm going to take with the queen, though, just to kind of make this pin, and maybe pawn to f5 and pawn to a4 at the right time. Again, I want to just trade rooks. I am up a rook versus a knight. If the queen moves away, we'll trade the rooks. We'll probably play a4 to open up more files. I have a passed d-pawn in the middle of the board. f5 is an idea here. If the queen moves away, then f5 is going to be played for sure. He plays f5 himself to stop me from doing that. I think I can just go for rook to e3. And if he takes, I'll take back. And so we are guaranteeing at least the trade of rooks. Queen there doesn't seem like a great move. I can now pile up on the pinned rook. He has to play king f7. Okay, he can do that, but once I move the king away, the rook is still pinned, and I'm still going to take the rook on d4 and win, or the rook on e6 and win material. So yeah, next move we're just taking the rook. So I think he had to play king f7 to try to protect it, because pinning the rook doesn't work for very long, and now we have three pieces attacking this one rook. It's only defended one time. He can't add two defenders with one move. and taking the rook also just loses material. So got a little bit overly greedy for that d4 pawn. I think he had to play king f7 to reinforce, but then I would have probably, yeah, I would have traded the rooks and at the right time, and I would still be up the exchange with a very good position. So we do get the win here against this over 2,000 rated opponent. So let's go ahead and check it out in the game review. All right, we got the game review here. Looks like we played at a 96.5% accuracy, which is quite high, so I'm pretty happy to see that. Our opponent played at an 88% accuracy, and it looks like on the graph, pretty equal game for quite a while. It looks like Black might have actually been even a little bit better off right before he made some kind of big blunder. And as soon as he made the blunder, then we were better for the rest of the game. So we had 1 inaccuracy, and he had 1 blunder. So we made some slight error, but then he blundered like the next move pretty much is what it looks like. So let's check it out. So it begins with knight f3, c5, b3, d5. It is important to play e3 in this position. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, if you rush with bishop to b2, Black does have this move f6, and now you don't really have the ability to play d4 to stop them from playing e5 because they can take, and you can't recapture with the pawn. You're pretty much going to allow Black to get 2 pawns in the center, which is not great. So we play the move e3 here instead. Knight c6, bishop b2, knight f6, bishop goes to make the pin, bishop breaks the pin, castle, a6. We do make the exchange of pieces. We jump our knight in the center. Black plays rook c8, and it's a pretty solid position overall. I'm not sure if we use the explorer. Yeah, I mean, the move rook c8 is the most common move in the position at this point. And yeah, both players, Black is playing very solidly, and we also have a pretty good position ourselves at the same time. So we go for d3. Computer likes the move c4 a little bit more. I did that move a little bit later on. But yeah, we went for d3 first, b5. I did decide to capture the bishop at this point. I think playing knight to d2 might also be fine, but I thought Black would try to keep the bishop alive, and even here it says white is still better, but I decided to just get rid of the bishop on c6 so that Black doesn't have that pair of bishops anymore. We maneuver the knight around to the e5 square. Black ends up taking it, and for all intents and purposes, it is a pretty equal position. We have, I would say, a very, very slight advantage, primarily because we have this good bishop on b2 and Black has a knight instead, but generally speaking, the position is pretty equal at the end of the day. Black brings the queen out, we attack it, queen retreats, we decide to bring the rook into the game. f6 is a very important move. It is Black's best move in the position. I think I did mention during the game that if you try to move like knight f6, we were going to go rook g3. Queen f5 would walk into the queen being trapped with rook g5. And queen h6, yeah, we could still go rook h3, we can go queen f3, we can continue keeping the pressure up on Black's position for sure. But he found the best defensive move. He played f6. We hit the queen. We brought our queen up the board a little bit. And yeah, the computer actually says that Black is maybe a tiny, tiny amount better. For human purposes, it's very much an equal position. It just really depends on who plays better. And that's kind of what we eventually did as the game went on. Taking on d5 is maybe not the best move, apparently. But I had this idea of playing d4, and my opponent messed up in this position here with c4. c4 was the big blunder. We played bishop a3 for the skewer, and we were, significantly better as the game went on from there. It looks like Black should have tried the move b4, and I guess the idea is to stop us from playing bishop to a3. And I wasn't entirely sure what I would have done here. I think I might have gone rook to c1. But then, yeah, I guess Black can play c4 since the queen is defending it, which would be quite bad. So maybe we would have had to have taken the pawn, moved the rook into the game. Yeah, Black is going to be a little bit better off here, though. Maybe not even just a little. Black is going to be better off in this position because the knight's going to reach the e4 square. So we would probably not want to let that happen. Yeah, it is a little bit of an advantage for Black if they had played this b4 move specifically, but they made the mistake. They played c4. We made the skewer, won the exchange, and then, yeah, e4 I think is a nice move because we really want to trade pawns and open up the center of the board because we have the pair of rooks. And as things progressed here, we really just tried to exchange pieces. We piled up on the pinned rook, got away from the pin that black was making, and now we're just going to take the rook next move. We're going to be up a full rook pretty soon as we grab the rook, and then it is very much a winning position for us here. So anyways, though, that is the 3 different games in this rating range of 1900 to 2000. So at this point, I might make a few videos still continuing the climb past 2000. I don't want to necessarily make any promises because the original intention was to get up to the rating of 2000, but we might do 2000 to 2100 or 2100 to 2200, but you know, we have gone all the way from the rating of 600 all the way up to, you know, playing against players in the rating range of 1900 to 2000. This particular opponent was over the rating of 2000, showing how to play these positions, showing how to play the Ready Nimzo Larsen attack. And hopefully you've enjoyed the Speedrun series. If you do want to see some of the earlier episodes, or if I do put a few more episodes later on in this series, you can see it in the playlist to the left of the video here. And so hopefully you have enjoyed this video. Hopefully you enjoyed the other ones, and I'll see you around in a future video. Have a good day.